Recent report says political polarization in the U.S., COVID-19 and U.S.-China tensions account for some of the top risks for the world in 2021. Eurasia Group, the political risk consultancy behind the January 4th report, publishes its forecast every year. What stands out about this year? Why was polarization in the U.S. the #1 risk? And what will be the impact of top risk #4, China-U.S. tensions? I'm pleased to be joined via Skype from New York by the man behind the geopolitical crystal ball, Ian Bremmer, political scientist, author and president of Eurasia Group. Mr. Bremmer, thank you very much for joining us. So first of all, help us understand, as you publish this report every year, what changes have happened in terms of the top risks from 2020 as we go into 2021?
Well, we've had the firm since 1998 when I founded it, 23 years. And last year, 2020, and this year, 2021, is the first time that domestic U.S. political risks have actually led the chart. Now, if you think about how you rate these risks, how you rank them, it's in terms of impact, likelihood, and imminence. And the United States is obviously the most powerful country in the world, so of course it has outsized weight in terms of if things happen inside the U.S. or China. It'll matter a lot more than Burkina Faso or Argentina. But the U.S. has also historically been much more politically stable. That's less true today. And I think the most important message that comes out of 2021 is, despite the fact that the United States remains by far the most powerful country holistically in the world, the U.S. is also today by far the most politically divided and the most economically unequal of all of the advanced industrial democracies. And that level of dysfunctionality is creating a lot of uncertainty and risk, both inside the United States and also globally.
Yeah. Well, you called the Biden administration the asterisk presidency. The report says, and I quote, Biden will try to reassert American leadership in global affairs, but polarization and an inability to manage crises at home means the U.S. won't inspire as much new confidence as Biden hopes. So this report was published before the Capitol riots. Now, after all the things that have happened after that, do you think this assessment is slightly changed?
I wish it was. I mean, this is one of these cases you write something and you hope it doesn't come true. And the reality is that on January 6th, a tremendous tragedy in my country, but also a crisis that was not big enough to in any way change the trajectory of political division. You saw just yesterday in the United States, 45 Republican senators vote to throw out the impeachment proceeding as unconstitutional after the President of the United States had actually called for an insurrection in the Capitol building, after the legislative branch of the government was almost decapitated. So, I mean, it's normalization. It's back to completely polarized politics. There was not a unifying moment that came from January 6th. And the last time we had a crisis, anything remotely like that, was, of course, the horrifying events of 9/11 in 2001. I was in New York at the time. I saw the second tower come down. But the thing about 9/11 is the country came together. And Bush had 92% approval ratings. Everyone was acting in a patriotic way to say, we can get through this. The events of January 6th have actually divided the country further apart. And I have no doubt next year that we will all be commemorating January 6th. But for some in America, it will be an incredible tragedy. For others, it will be a moment of inspired patriotism. And that's a truly horrible thing.
Is there any way that President Biden and his administration can mitigate this risk?
Well, he wants to. There's no question. Let's be clear that Biden, as his 40-plus year career in Senate, was always someone who reached across the aisle and has a lot of good relationships with Republican senators. But the Republicans do understand that the best way for them to retake the House, retake the Senate 2022 is the politics of obstruction. I do think the fact that the 2 seats in Georgia were actually retaken by the Democrats, in part because former President Trump actually was doing everything he can to say that the election was rigged, and that actually suppressed Republican turnout. That means that the Democrats now have the slimmest of majority margins, 50-50 with the tie vote from the vice president in the Senate. And that means that Biden will be able to come close to a $1.9 trillion bailout plan by April. It does mean that they'll be able to get more governing done. And that money is going to go to American workers, whether they voted for Biden or Trump. That money is going to go to states that are nearing bankruptcy, whether they're red states or blue states. So that's going to help. But I want to be clear, it's a Band-Aid. It doesn't address the structural challenges that are in the United States that have been building. I mean, Trump exacerbated them. But the idea that American institutions are rigged against the average American is something that's been growing for decades now, including under 8 years of Obama-Biden. And it's going to be very difficult for them to turn that ship around.
Well, the report also says when the most powerful country is so divided, everybody has a problem. So what are the impacts or consequences of this risk number one on the world?
I'll give you an example. It means that the most important multilateral trade deals being done in the world right now don't involve the United States. It's the EU-China investment deal. It's RCEP. It's EU-Mercosur. But the ability and the willingness of the United States to take a leadership role on international trade architecture is massively constrained by that level of international division. For those that would want the United States to play a more assertive role as a global policeman, the level of interest is really low. You look at, for example, Turkey, which has caused a great deal of geopolitical anxiety around its region in Libya, in Syria, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Greece, Cyprus. The United States has been marginal to all of those conflicts. And since the United States is by far the most powerful military power in the world, and that's not changing, that creates uncertainty. And then finally, you have the fact of promoting values, common values, rule of law, democracy. I mean, there's no question that there's no moral equivalence between the United States and Russia, the United States and China. You still have rule of law. You still have an independent judiciary in the United States. But it's also true that countries around the world don't look at the U.S. and say, I want my political system to run like that. You might say that about Canada or Japan or Germany, but you don't say that about the U.S. And so when American political figures come out and say, well, we don't like the way your election was held, they say, well, you don't even like the way your election was held, the United States. How do you say that? I think it's very interesting. In the last 24 hours, you may notice that there was a common G7 statement from all of the G7 foreign ministers condemning the imprisonment of Alexei Navalny, the opposition member, and also all of the arrests, the 3,000 plus arrests that occurred in Russia across the country this weekend. Now, I think it's important to note that if the United States had made that statement by themselves, it really would have had far less impact. So the hope would be that a Biden administration, which has already shown they want to rejoin a lot of multilateral architecture, you saw that with the Paris Climate Accord, of course, the World Health Organization, the COVAX agreement on vaccine distribution, to the extent the Americans are going to try to truly be more multilateral with common thinking American allies around the world, that can also help to mitigate some of this polarization.
Well, Mr. Bremmer, I think a lot of people disagree here with the point of there is no moral equivalence between the United States and Russia and the United States and China. And actually, a lot of people would argue that's precisely the problem to a lot of the things that we're seeing, this kind of American exceptionalism or Americans different. But anyway, I don't want to go in there because that's a much longer discussion there. I just want to really talk about...
We can have that at some point in the future. That's fine.
Yeah, at some point we can discuss that, but not today. Let's talk about the risk associated with long COVID, because I think that's risk number one, which is really important, and we have to kind of be concise here. What do you think is the implication of the exposure of the underlying vulnerabilities of many markets, as was pointed out in your report?
I think that 2020 COVID was really a healthcare risk. It was mostly about all these people that were dying around the world. In 2021, it is much less about that. I mean, once you get vaccines in the arms of 10% of the population, you're talking about almost all the people that are truly vulnerable to serious hospitalization and death. So that's an enormous shift in terms of being able to run a more open economy. But the economic implications for coronavirus will last much longer on businesses, on members of the working class that, who aren't in the knowledge economy, who can't work easily from their offices in their homes, for example. And as that occurs, there's going to be a much growing gap in the advanced industrial democracies between rich and poor, where inequality has already been growing and causing political illegitimacy, and also between medium and wealthy countries, income countries, and poorer income countries. We've already seen in the last year 150 more million people entering extreme poverty. First time in 20 years that number hasn't been going down. 2021, that number has the capacity to go up a lot. And as you know, you were discussing in your last segment, vaccines are going to be rolled out a lot faster among the wealthiest countries and in China than they will be among poorer and medium income countries. And that also is going to increase the gap.
Well, to wrap up, I have about 2 minutes left altogether. So I give you 1 minute. What can China and the United States potentially do in terms of addressing this last risk you just mentioned?
You certainly hope that you can work in the areas that there are common interests. I mean, there's no trust of China for the United States. There's no trust of the United States for China, and that's unfortunate. But there's an enormous amount of interdependence. And as we heard from President Xi addressing the World Economic Forum the other day, a Cold War is in no one's interest. It would be a strategic failure for both countries if we entered a Cold War, because the economic interdependence of the two countries is so extraordinarily deep. And that wasn't true at all between the Americans and the Soviets, and I think it should give us a reason for hope.
It did, and there is a lot of expectation that at least some kind of de-escalation will happen between the two countries so that the world can benefit, including the two countries. Many thanks to Ian Bremmer, President of the Eurasia Group. And with that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.